English by the Nature Method, Chapter 57. The 57th Chapter. The British Empire. Marshall had often promised Storm to take him to the House of Commons when the members were present and the House at work. Storm wanted to see some of its famous members and hear them speak. Marshall felt this promise as a debt of honor. So, at length, one afternoon after office hours, he decided to pay this debt. He went with Storm to the House of Commons, and they spent some hours there, listening to the different speakers. Among other matters, several colonial questions were discussed, which seemed to be of much interest to Storm. On their way home, he seemed to be thinking of something, and after dinner, when they were making themselves comfortable, each in a big chair, he said to Marshall, "The colonial questions which were discussed in Parliament today interested me more than anything else, though I didn't always catch the meaning, for after all I know far too little about the colonies. For instance, I don't know how they are governed." "It isn't so easy," Marshall said, "to tell you in a few words about their government, because they are not all governed in the same manner. But we could talk a little about the question until bedtime. I'll start in a moment. First, I'll go out to the kitchen and get some matches so that we can try the new cigarettes I bought today." He did so, and a few moments later they were enjoying the cigarettes. "Well, Storm," said Marshall, taking up the conversation again, "I'll first tell you about a number of countries which used to be governed by Britain. The best known of them are Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, India, and Pakistan. We call these countries dominions. They have their own governments, which look after affairs of interest to the dominions themselves. Regarding foreign affairs which are of importance to the whole empire, they have the same right as the mother country to decide what steps should be taken. So you see, Storm, that it would be incorrect to regard Britain and the dominions as a country with its colonies. It's rather a number of states which are held together by the same interests of trade and politics. But the dominions cannot have had all these political rights from the beginning." Storm interrupted. "No, they are the fruits of a development which has been going on for many years," Marshall continued. "At first, the dominions were simply colonies which could not make decisions regarding many of their own affairs without asking Britain, but the political development which took place in the 19th century has made it necessary for Britain to give them greater and greater liberty to look after their own affairs, and by the year 1900 half of the dominions had gained their present rights, and the fact that the dominions have gained these political rights is no doubt an important reason why Britain has been able to keep her connection with them," Storm said. "It's the same with nations as with people. You can almost always have your way with them if your behavior towards them is gentle and understanding. If Britain had used force against her present dominions instead of being gentle with them, they would have been lost now, I suppose, as her former North American colonies were lost when she used force against them, sending armies across the sea to fight them." "No doubt you are right," Marshall replied. "But though the dominions are the best known parts of the British Empire, we must not forget to say a few words about the colonies proper. They are parts of the British Empire with only a few Englishmen, soldiers and officials living among the natives. They are governed from Britain, that is, by the Colonial Office in London. The Colonial Office sends a representative, a so-called governor, to each of the colonies to look after the affairs of the colony. Of course, he can't do all the work himself, but has a number of officials to help him. He and the officials together make up the highest authority of the colony. Naturally, the governor is always in connection with the Colonial Office in London, telling it what happens in the colony and getting orders as to what to do in important matters." "Wouldn't it be more just of Britain to let the colonies have governments of their own, just like the dominions?" Storm asked. "Perhaps it would be just," Marshall replied, "but the natives of most of the colonies are not white people, and wouldn't be able to govern themselves. When the English first came to these places, the natives in many cases were nothing but wild or savage tribes living under the conditions offered by nature. So the English have had to take care of them. However, as the natives become more used to European ideas, It's the intention of the British to give all the colonies self-government. I know that it's the general opinion of many foreigners that Britain has only thought of her own interests in connection with the colonies, but this is not quite fair. In the colonies, where the natives were savages when they came under British rule, Britain has really done a lot of good work for the people, making their life easier, building schools and hospitals for them, etc., and on the whole trying to be just and fair. But it would be incorrect to say that all the colonies liked to be under British rule. At least many of the people in India did not like it, as they came to feel equal with the Europeans, Storm said with a smile. From the papers and also from a number of books I have read, I know that there used to be much trouble with India from time to time. Could you tell me a little more about the government of India? I have no definite idea of it. Before 1947, the government of India was different from that of the Dominions, as well as from that of the colonies, was Marshall's reply. It did not govern itself. It was governed by the British and the Indians together. The country is so large, having nearly 400 million people, that there was a special government department in London, called the India Office, looking after Indian affairs. But as you mentioned, Britain often had trouble with India, mostly on account of the manner in which it was governed. Many of the Indians wanted their country to be given self-government as soon as possible, and wasn't it to do justice to them, Marshall, to offer them what they wanted? Storm asked. If it was only a question of doing justice to them, they would have been given self-government a long time before, Marshall replied. In 1917, the British government declared that its intention was the development, step by step, of the same sort of self-government for India as the Dominions had. But India consists of many nations, with different ideas of life and with different religions. Several of them were not at all interested in a national and united India, but thought only of their own interests, while others were satisfied with British rule, because they thought that if India was left to itself, there would be more trouble, perhaps war, instead of the good conditions that the country enjoyed under British rule. That is one of the reasons why Britain at one time was not willing to give up India, even if Indians like the famous Gandhi, for instance, wanted it. It seems as if the British were a little in doubt as to what to do with Gandhi, Storm said. Several times they punished him by sending him to prison, and when he had been imprisoned for some time, they set him at liberty again. In my opinion, they might just as well have given up punishing him, for I am sure that punishment cannot change the political opinions of a man like that, even if it's a punishment which sends him to prison for several years. The British didn't think that either when they put him in prison. They regarded him as a danger to the state, because it was his political purpose to make the Indians stop working in industry and thus make trouble for the British government. However, after war of 1939-1945, the British government made a definite plan for India. They declared that the British troops and government officials would leave India in 1948. The Indians would then have to decide for themselves whether they wanted to remain in the empire as a self-governing dominion, or whether they wanted to be a completely separate country without any connection with Britain. In 1947, the English and the Indians agreed to divide the whole of India into the two dominions of India and Pakistan, and on the 15th of August of that year, these dominions received self-government. For my part, I hope that these new dominions will keep their connection with Britain, for they have so many advantages of trade to offer each other. And I think, too, that good old Clive, in that case, would be happy in his grave. Who's Clive? Storm asked. Clive, you don't say that. You've lived in England for about a year without hearing the name of Robert Clive? I'm afraid so, but I would like to hear something about him. Indeed, I must tell you about him at once. You cannot go about without knowing who Robert Clive is. He was a great soldier and is famous for the battles he fought in India against the French and the Indians when the British control of India began. He was born in 1725, and as a boy he was very interested in military life and wanted to be a soldier himself. He made a kind of military organization among his small friends with military law. After leaving school, he was sent to India. In all, he had 3 long stays in that country, but it was during his first stay there that he did wonders. I'm thinking especially of the fighting at Arcot, which I should like to tell you a little about. But first of all, you must hear something about the political development in India which led up to those fights. The French at that time had a large army in India, and they had gained control of a large part of the country. The brave fighting of the French soldiers made a great impression upon the natives, who respected them and supported them by letting their own soldiers fight with them. Now it was the plan of the French to use the great power they had gained to drive the English out of India. The English had tried to stop the rapid expansion of French power, but without success, no doubt. One of the reasons for this was that they only had a few thousand soldiers in India. The greater part of them were at Madras, the most important city. Was the expansion of French power to continue, or could anything be done to stop it? Clive, who at that time held a position equal to that of a captain in the army, was of the opinion that the English should try to conquer Arcot, the capital of one of the native states which was supported by the French. Then, he supposed, some of the soldiers that were on their way to Madras would be sent to Arcot instead in order to retake it, and consequently there would not be so many soldiers to fight against the English at Madras. The officers in that city thought his plan a good one and asked him if he himself was willing to perform what he had proposed that they should do. Clive at once agreed to this, and in a heavy storm with thunder and lightning he marched off towards Arcot as fast as possible with his troops, which only consisted of 200 English soldiers and 300 native soldiers, the so-called sepoys, commanded by 8 officers, only 2 of whom had been in battle before. The soldiers of the town of Arcot weren't very brave, and at once gave up the place without a fight. This was easier than Clive had expected, but if he could not hold the city against the enemy, nothing would have been gained. He knew that they would soon try to retake the town, and that he would be forced to fight with only the few troops he had, because some soldiers that had been sent to help him had not been able to reach Arcot on account of the enemy. So he prepared everything to hold the town, took care of the districts, of the distribution of food, etc. The strength of the enemy army that came to retake the town was much greater than that of Clive's, as the natives at first had more than 6,000 soldiers, and in addition 4,000 of the troops had been fighting near Madras were sent to support them, so it seemed quite impossible that Clive should be able to break the strength of this army. The fighting lasted for 50 days. The native troops surrounded the town, and there was fighting every day. Towards the end of that time, conditions had become very bad for Clive and his men. Many of his soldiers had been killed, big holes had been shot in the walls of the town, and in addition to this there was but little food. However, Clive took care that the distribution of it was just and did his best to help where help was needed. The troops outside thought that he would have to give up the town and told him as much, but he said angrily that they would soon know how British soldiers could fight. The natives then decided to take the town, cost what it might, and a hard battle began. Clive, who had not had any rest for several days, had thrown himself upon his bed, but when he heard that the battle which was to decide everything had begun, he rose from his bed at once and led the fighting himself. The enemy went forth to battle with a number of elephants in front of them. As soon as the troops in the town began using the guns, the elephants got quite wild and rushed back, killing many of the natives. Without the elephants, the enemy now tried with all their might again and again to take the town, but they were driven back every time. The strength of the little army in the town, fighting like lions and bravely commanded by Clive, was too great. At last, the enemy was forced to give up the fight, and the rest of the troops marched away from the town. Clive and his troops had won the battle. From this day forth, the French lost their power. Many of the natives would not have them any longer, when they found out how great the military strength of the English was. Clive fought with all his might against the French and the natives that still supported them, and before long the day came when the power of the English in India was as great as and even greater than that of the French. "Thank you very, very much, Marshal," said Tom. "However, "There is one more thing I should like to ask you about," he continued. "Certainly, old man," Marshall replied. "I should like you to tell me something about Ceylon," said Storm. "I know that it's a very large island near the south coast of India, from which we get very good tea. But tell me, Marshall," he said, "is Ceylon part of the new Dominion of India?" "No," answered Marshall, "Ceylon is not part of the Dominion of India. It has become a separate dominion with self-government, in the same way as India and Pakistan," he continued. "Thank you, Marshall," said Storm. "I hope we can continue our discussion of the British Empire some other evening."